Welcome to AskFOI, where we answer the most common questions we receive on prophecy, Israel, and the Bible. With me today is Les Crawford. Welcome, Les.
Thanks, Steve. Great to be with you today.
Les, in Acts, we see the apostles proclaiming the gospel to both Jewish audiences and to Gentiles, but it raises the question how these two audiences might have reacted to the gospel. Gentiles, of course, weren't living in anticipation of a Messiah. So the question I'd like to consider in today's episode is, how did first century Jews and Gentiles understand the gospel differently?
Well, Steve, you've actually introduced the answer very well for me, because you've mentioned the book of Acts and you've mentioned the fact that the apostles preached that gospel, and they had various audiences. Initially, they had Jewish audiences, particularly through Peter's proclamation. And when you look at his sermons in Acts 2 and Acts 3, you find out that he's referencing the Old Testament in explanation for what they've experienced of the coming of the Spirit on the day of Pentecost and the phenomenon associated with that. And that raised curiosity, it raised questions. And as he proclaims Jesus, the Messiah, to this audience, he's able to show them that this is actually continuous with what God's plan is, that God has a purpose for the Jewish people. It included their coming Messiah. Now that he's come, they need to understand that he has come and what that means for them. So he could help them to see that there was a continuity in what God had planned for the Jewish people. And initially it was a remarkable response. I mean, 3,000 plus people respond to that first message. And as he preaches again in Acts 3, he connects the Old Testament prophecies to the name in which this miracle has been accomplished, which is the stage that allows an audience again to pay attention to this new, in a sense, revelation, but it's a continuous revelation from the Old Testament. Because Moses prophesied concerning Jesus, and so did all the prophets. So for the Jewish people, this new proclamation from these rather obscure individuals who weren't part of the high priestly class or part of the Jewish leadership, they are actually being authenticated by the Old Testament scriptures. And the message is initially welcomed. Now, of course, Peter also gets the advantage of speaking to a Gentile audience when he goes and speaks to Cornelius. And to get him to do that, he had to be convinced that this was not going to be an unclean thing. It wasn't going to be an offensive thing to do. And so he's prepared by a vision that occurs 3 times that preps him for the people who come to visit to call him to see Cornelius. So it's pretty obvious that the Jewish community was not expecting Gentiles to be included. And when he speaks to this family gathered in their home, they respond powerfully, just like on the day of Pentecost. Then he's got to justify the fact that he went to Gentiles before the other Jewish leaders. So you get this contrast. Then you get Paul, who's called to be an apostle to the Gentiles, and he encounters different audiences, but particularly in Acts 17, he talks to a group on Mars Hill, or the Areopagus, who are always interested in something new, always interested in something fresh, but he can't preach from the Old Testament scriptures because they don't have a connection to the Old Testament scriptures. So what he does is he uses a local unknown God as a bridging point to actually talk to them about the true God. And he does get a mixed response. It's pretty minimal response, really, compared to the day of Pentecost. So the Gentiles didn't have that Old Testament connection. So Paul had to adjust his method. He didn't change the message, but adjust his method of introducing this revelation. And as it turns out, the Gentile responses grow and grow, and the church becomes increasingly Gentile, and the Jewish portion diminishes until eventually it's almost non-existent by you get to the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries later on. So yeah, very different audiences, very different connection to the Old Testament. The Jews could see where they fitted in by the Spirit's enabling, his illuminating of the passages. The Gentiles had to see this as a fresh and a new thing, but they still all had the same spiritual need. They all needed salvation, they all needed forgiveness, they all needed a reconciliation with God, but approaching it slightly differently.
And you said that Paul's message didn't change. So, as a follow up, just to clarify, we're not talking about two different gospels, or are we talking about a different gospel for the Jewish people and the Gentiles? This is a question we receive here sometimes.
No, it's definitely the same gospel, but the way in which you connect with the audience is quite different. It's still Jesus crucified, risen from the dead, ascended to heaven, offering salvation and forgiveness because of what he did on the cross. That's the central part of the gospel, always has been, 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 to 3. But I do think that we have to take note of our audience. Different audiences. It's a bit like our mission today. I mean, we reach Jewish people, we reach Gentile people. Our focus is the Jewish people, but we have to be very sensitive to who they are and how they would react at what we say to them and how we say what we say to them. So, no different gospel, one gospel. Paul said no other gospel was allowed to be preached in the book of Galatians, but it's a different audience, and we have to take note of that.
Amen. This is really helpful, Les. Les actually wrote a blog about this subject, and we'll make sure to link to it in the description on this video. Thank you.
You're welcome. Great to be here again.